To say I'm excited to talk about Bret Hart versus Steve Austin at WrestleMania XIII would truly be an understatement. To this very day, I can still never decide what my favourite WrestleMania match of all time is, but the Hitman versus Stone Cold is definitely the match I always go back to. This showdown really does have it all, and as cliched as the saying is, the match really is an emotional roller coaster. I consider this match a real sign of the times. Steve Austin was getting red hot and fans enjoyed seeing a guy taking no bullshit from anyone. Meanwhile, Bret Hart fans were torn as their loyalty to Bret was being tested due to his actions building up to the match. When the two met in the ring in Chicago at WrestleMania, they both told the story of their characters. Bret showed he was still the excellence of execution, but now with a mean streak, and Steve Austin showed that no matter how much you take out of him, he won't ever give up. What we need to remember also is that this legendary match was never really supposed to happen, but thanks to Shawn Michaels losing his smile, we gained a WrestleMania classic. To gain a full understanding of why the match was so important, our story needs to begin 1 year earlier at WrestleMania XII. At WrestleMania XII, Steve Austin worked his first Mania match against Savio Vega. Viewers will already know that Steve Austin was working here as the Ringmaster and was represented by Ted DiBiase. 2 months after losing this match, Steve Austin would get a rematch against Savio in a Caribbean strap match with a stipulation in place. If Austin lost, Ted DiBiase would have to leave the WWF. Austin was now billed as Stone Cold Steve Austin going into this match, and he revealed that he intentionally lost the match so he could get rid of Ted DiBiase, who he felt was holding him back. Stone Cold Steve Austin was now gearing up to a pivotal night in his career at the 1996 King of the Ring. Going back to WrestleMania XII, Bret Hart would lose his WWF Championship to Shawn Michaels in a 60-minute Iron Man match that ended up going into sudden death. In the storyline, Bret was a little bitter that he lost the title and he decided to take a few months away from the WWF. In reality, Bret was going to try his hand in acting and recorded a few episodes of the TV show Lonesome Dove: The Outlaw Years. Before his departure though, Bret went on the annual European tour where he had a few matches against Hunter Hearst Helmsley and Stone Cold Steve Austin. While Bret Hart was gone from TV, Steve Austin would work hard in climbing the ladder and getting out of the lower end of the card. As fate would have it, the planned winner of the 1996 King of the Ring, Triple H, found himself in WWF's bad books due to the events surrounding the Click and the Curtain Call, so Steve Austin was booked to win the tournament in his place and get crowned as the new King of the Ring. We know the story here. Austin defeated Jake Roberts in the final and his world famous Austin 316 catchphrase was born. Stone Cold had now arrived, but he still had a long way to go. Over the summer of 1996, Steve Austin would taunt Bret Hart while the Hitman was gone from WWF TV. Bret meanwhile was getting offers from other promotions, including WCW, to jump ship and leave the WWF. This didn't stop Steve Austin from relentlessly taunting the Hitman in his absence. Bret made his WWF return on the October 21st edition of Monday Night Raw. Bret revealed that WCW made him an offer to join the company, but he elected to stay with the WWF. Bret Hart said in the middle of the ring as Steve Austin watched backstage, "There was a certain rival wrestling organisation. They made me a great offer. They dealt with me with integrity and nothing but in an honourable fashion, and I can't say anything bad about how they represented themselves. I was faced with a tough dilemma. Should I come back to the WWF or find new adventures somewhere else? It's not that long ago I said, I'm not greedy for money, I'm greedy for respect. I've done a lot of soul searching, but when it comes down to it, everything I've ever done and everything I ever plan on doing, I owe it all to my WWF fans. I won't be going anywhere, I'll be with the WWF forever." Bret went on to say he wasn't bitter about losing to Shawn Michaels at WrestleMania XII, but he did say there was something about Shawn Michaels that really bugs him. Bret then said that Shawn Michaels would never be as tough or smart as he was. Bret said he will come back and defeat Shawn Michaels, but in the meantime, he would take on who he considered was the greatest wrestler in the WWF at that moment, and that was Stone Cold Steve Austin. This was foreshadowing the planned booking arrangements. Bret would work against Stone Cold initially, and eventually get to Shawn Michaels at WrestleMania XIII. Before getting another few jabs into Shawn Michaels, Bret announced that the Hitman vs Stone Cold would happen at Survivor Series 96 in Madison Square Garden. Before continuing on, a lot of people have issues with Bret Hart's promo skills, and a lot of people believe that Bret Hart couldn't put together a good promo. I tend to disagree with this. Doubters should fire up the WWE Network and check out Raw on October 21st, 1996. Bret gets the exact reactions that are needed, and he delivers some great lines and quotes. Babyfaces in today's wrestling struggle to get the kind of reactions Bret was receiving during this time period. When Bret speaks, the fans are hanging on every word. When Bret ends his points during the promo, the crowd erupts. I understand that Bret Hart doesn't really change up his vocal range that much during promos, and he sounds very samey, but he gets the job done every time. Just look at his heel promos in 1997 also. Some of those were fantastic. Back to 1996 and on to the Survivor Series match. Not much to say except if you haven't watched this match, you have full permission to stop this video and check it out, as long as you come back to me. Bret vs Austin in Madison Square Garden shows how good Steve Austin was as a technician, as he hung in there with Bret Hart move for move. Steve Austin has said himself that he came out of Survivor Series 96 as a better wrestler because he was able to work with Hart on this night. Like their forthcoming match at WrestleMania XIII, Bret and Austin called the match in the ring, and when you take this into consideration, it highlights just how good both men were at reading the crowds and knowing when to speed up and slow down. It's a great match. Bret would get the win, but Steve Austin would also gain a whole lot from this match. He actually gained more momentum after the loss at Madison Square Garden. Thanks to his winning performance at Survivor Series, Bret would receive a title shot at WWF In Your House It's Time the following month. Before the match took place, Steve Austin would make it clear to Bret that their rivalry was far from over. With Steve Austin still in the back of his mind, Bret marched into In Your House in December where he failed to capture the championship, but there was definitely some character building going on here with the Hitman. During the pre-match interview at In Your House It's Time, Bret's time was cut short as Shawn Michaels' theme music began playing, which seriously annoyed the Hitman. Bret would voice his frustrations, asking why is his time being cut off for Shawn Michaels. This showed Bret as being petty and bitter, planting seeds for what was to come the following month at the Royal Rumble. Shawn would be the guest commentator for the match at In Your House, and he would end up costing Bret the match when he got on the ring apron. Bret was absolutely furious. It was around this time that fans would say that anytime things didn't go Bret's way, he would moan and he would cry about it. The thing I find most interesting about this, and why I liked it so much, was that if you were a Bret Hart fan, you were inclined to agree with him to a certain extent. Bret had millions of supporters, and it seemed like he was letting himself down by his actions and constant moaning. It was a really interesting dynamic that tested the patience and loyalty of Bret Hart's fans. Bret really wasn't wrong, and he had every right to be upset with how things always played out unfairly towards him, but the way he went about voicing his concerns made him out to be a sore loser. It was all great work, and whatever you may feel about the Hitman, he deserves a ton of credit for how this all played out on TV. The Royal Rumble in 1997 was held in Shawn Michaels' hometown of San Antonio, Texas, and he would be getting a title shot at the WWF Championship, much to the dismay of Bret Hart. So Bret is now angry that he has to enter the Royal Rumble to get another shot at the championship, which he feels he should have already won. Steve Austin would also be entering the Royal Rumble in 1997, and he had a great early showing in the match, eliminating guys in quick succession and spending much of the match in the ring on his own, waiting for the next competitor. Steve's demeanour totally changed when the countdown ended and Bret Hart's music played in the arena. Bret walked to the ring with purpose, and the two would tangle it up again in the middle of the Royal Rumble. The Royal Rumble match ended when Steve Austin got eliminated by Bret Hart, but the referees didn't see the elimination. Austin decided to jump back into the ring, eliminate Vader and Undertaker before eliminating Bret Hart to win the match. The referees didn't see Austin get eliminated, and therefore he was announced as the 1997 Royal Rumble winner. Again, Bret was furious and he vented his anger after the match. This all went further to portray Bret Hart as a bitter person and a sore loser, even though, again, he wasn't in the wrong. Also that night at the Royal Rumble, Shawn Michaels defeated Psycho Sid for the WWF Championship. Even though Bret Hart had not won the Rumble, the plans were still for a Shawn vs Bret WrestleMania rematch at WrestleMania XIII. Shawn was also featured in promotional material for the event, which heavily indicated that the headline matches would be Sid vs Undertaker and Shawn vs Bret. Weeks after the Royal Rumble, however, Shawn vacated the championship after saying he lost his smile during an infamous promo. Shawn would give up the belt and not be competing at WrestleMania XIII. Bret Hart really felt that Shawn was deliberately doing this so he wouldn't have to return the favour to Bret from the previous WrestleMania. Bret felt Shawn was faking an injury so he wouldn't have to lose to Hart on the grand stage, even though Bret done the honour for Shawn the year prior. Whatever the case, Bret Hart would need a new WrestleMania opponent. Before getting to WrestleMania, let's go back to the episode of Raw that aired right after the 1997 Royal Rumble. Bret opened up Raw and said he was quitting the company because every time he gets a title opportunity, he gets screwed. Bret blamed Shawn Michaels, Steve Austin and Vince McMahon for his misfortunes. Because Bret wasn't getting the opportunities that were promised to him when he returned to the WWF in October, he was now quitting the company. Steve Austin then hit the ring and said that since Bret came back, he has done nothing but cry. Austin told Bret to just go home. Later that night, WWF President Gorilla Monsoon came to the ring and announced he has put together a special Final Four match due to Steve Austin's tainted win at the Royal Rumble. The winner of this match would get the title shot at WrestleMania XIII against Shawn Michaels. Because Vader and Undertaker were illegally eliminated by Austin, they would be included in this special Final Four match. Steve Austin himself would also be included in the match, and finally, if he accepts, Bret Hart could come back after quitting the WWF just half an hour earlier and also be included in this special match. Steve Austin wasn't very happy with Gorilla Monsoon's announcement, and Bret Hart came back moments later and accepted the match invitation. The match was now set, and at February's In Your House pay-per-view, the undisputed #1 contender for Shawn Michaels' WWF Championship would be the winner of the Final Four match. As previously mentioned though, Shawn lost his smile and he would vacate the title. The Final Four match was now for the WWF Championship. Whoever won the Final Four match would be the champion going into WrestleMania. The Final Four match is another great match that you should take the time to watch if you haven't already. While the production values on this particular In Your House pay-per-view leave a lot to be desired, the four men put on a great match. The rules also were quite different than your normal four-way matches. The match was contested under elimination rules, where elimination happened if you were pinned, submitted or thrown over the top rope. It was a fun match that also included Vader getting some serious colour. In the end, Bret finally recaptured the WWF Championship. It seemed that all the moaning and crying could now end for Bret. Bret was now the four-time WWF champion and everything was right with the world. The next night on Raw, however, things would not go as Bret would have liked, and the crying would continue as Psycho Sid came back and defeated the Hitman for the WWF Championship due to interference by Steve Austin. Bret, again, had got screwed by Steve Austin. It was also announced earlier in the night that The Undertaker was the #1 contender for the championship at WrestleMania, so it was now Undertaker versus Sid for the WWF Championship at WrestleMania. Bret Hart, meanwhile, would go into WrestleMania to try to get revenge on Steve Austin in a submission match. Before continuing on, for years and years I could always remember the match initially being promoted as a no DQ match and not a submissions match, but I never really cared to look much into this. I thought I must have just imagined it, but doing research for this video allowed me to go back and watch episodes of Raw leading up to the match, and yes, it was initially announced as a no holds barred match. If you watch the February 24th episode of Raw, Vince McMahon announces that Bret vs Austin will be a no holds barred match, no mention of submissions whatsoever. Then on the March 3rd episode of Raw, it's announced that it will be a submission match, so making this video finally put that to rest in my head. After digging into this more, Dave Meltzer actually reported that the match was changed to a submission match because WWF confirmed they would definitely have the services of Ken Shamrock on the night of WrestleMania, and Vince felt that Shamrock's legitimacy as a submission specialist was enough to change the match from no holds barred to submission and have Shamrock be the special referee for the bout. I wouldn't want to say this is absolute fact for obvious reasons, but it's out there and it was reported by Dave Meltzer, so take from that what you will. Steve Austin has since said that he found out about the submission match while sitting at home. He initially did not like the idea. He didn't really do many submission moves at all. Steve didn't need to worry though. It was the fact that the match was contested under submission only rules that made the finish so special. Bret Hart had one last opportunity to win the WWF Championship before his match with Steve Austin. If Bret Hart could defeat Sid in a steel cage match on the March 17th edition of WWF Raw, then he would become the WWF Champion and he would be able to defend that belt against Steve Austin in their WrestleMania match. This meant that Austin and Undertaker also had an interest in who won this steel cage match, as these men would be getting a title shot depending on who won the match. Steve Austin tried to help Bret win, but in the end, The Undertaker cost Bret Hart the victory and Sid won. Another monumental loss for Bret Hart on this night led to him finally snapping, shoving Vince McMahon and cutting a very memorable promo that was filled with swear words. Vince McMahon himself has said that this was the genesis of the Mr. McMahon character. He said something went off in his mind when Bret shoved him, and he traces the birth of the Mr. McMahon gimmick to this very night. Again, this is another example to show those who believe Bret couldn't cut a promo. The full unedited promo is available on the WWE Network. But now the seeds were all planted and were ready for WrestleMania. Steve Austin's popularity was soaring and Bret Hart was sick and tired of all the injustice that had been done against him. It was time for the two to meet at WrestleMania XIII. UFC superstar Ken Shamrock was introduced as a special guest referee for the match, as a match of this scale needed the world's most dangerous man to call for the bell when someone submitted. It was time for Bret Hart and Steve Austin to finally go to war. Ken Shamrock was the first man in the ring, followed by Steve Austin, who had a cool glass shattering effect set up in the entranceway. Finally, Bret made his way to the ring. Bret's pop was louder than Steve Austin's for sure, but there were still plenty of Austin fans in attendance. Austin wasted no time in taking down Bret Hart in the opening moments of the match, laying in the punches as the two rolled around and brawled. The fight would then go deep into the crowd and around ringside. When the action got back into the ring, Bret started working Austin's leg as the crowd continued to get louder and louder during the bout. Bret busted Steve Austin open on the announcer's table and the blood began to pour out of Austin's head. Eventually, Austin was able to fight back and choke Bret with some cables, but Bret was able to hit Steve Austin with a ring bell. Bret then applied the sharpshooter to Stone Cold, and this is when the famous visual of the match occurred. Steve Austin stayed in the sharpshooter for a long time, seeming to lose consciousness only to keep fighting back, raising his body and screaming in pain as the blood ran down his face. In the end, Austin was in the sharpshooter for far too long and he passed out. Austin never submitted, but he couldn't continue. Ken Shamrock called for an end to the match and Bret was declared the winner. This was the absolute perfect finish to the match. It could not have been written any better. Austin looked like a legit tough guy who would rather go through immense pain than give up, and Bret looked like the excellence of execution that Austin just could not overcome. After the match is when more magic would happen. Bret would continue to attack Steve Austin, gaining boos from the audience. The crowd was sympathetic to Austin and respected him for not submitting, and when they saw Bret try to get in more cheap shots after the match, the crowd began to turn on Bret Hart. Eventually, Shamrock suplexed Bret to force him to stop attacking Austin, which gained a huge pop from the audience. Ken Shamrock challenged Bret to fight him right there in the ring, but Bret declined and walked away to a loud chorus of boos. Bret walked back up the aisle, flipping off the fans and shouting as he went back to the locker room. All of this bitterness and built-up frustrations over the months had paid off. Bret was now able to be a selfish heel and go on to do some of the best work in his career. Meanwhile, another referee came to the ring to try and help Steve Austin, who was beginning to come around. Austin hit the Stone Cold Stunner on the referee, effectively refusing any help and walking back up the aisle. Austin struggled onto his feet and limped backstage to cheers and people chanting his name. In the course of the match, from start to end, Bret Hart had turned heel and Steve Austin had turned babyface. It was truly one of the best matches not only in WrestleMania history, but in the complete history of professional wrestling. Never before has a double turn like this been done so successfully. From here, Bret Hart would go full-blown anti-American and he reformed the Hart Foundation. Steve Austin would continue being the anti-hero, but this time he would come out to massive cheers from audiences. The WrestleMania XIII submission match solidified and legitimised Stone Cold Steve Austin as the next big star in the WWF, eventually becoming the biggest draw in the history of the company.